Start complete.
Y'all have a good trip.
Roger that.
Take it slowly. Slowly wait for it.
30.
29.
28.
27.
26.
25. 24.
23. 22.
21.
20 seconds and counting.
19.
18. 17.
16. 15.
14.
13.
12.
11.
10 seconds.
6.
5.
4. And 3.
2.
1.
Hello, welcome to Trust No One, the X-Files podcast, where some of my fellow agents and I discuss episodes of the X-Files. Today, we'll be discussing the 18th episode called Miracle Man, directed by Michael Lange. Michael Lange. It first aired on the 26th of January, 1995. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Brad.
Hi.
So let's just get right into this. Let's start with the very first question. Does this episode present any compelling evidence of the existing of faith healing? And go.
I would argue yes. I mean, I think, the crowds that get drawn and the amount of people that come there. I mean, obviously, the murder subplot is a bit of a turn off, isn't it? In terms of you're not really going to be up for going somewhere that you're likely to be killed. But, beside that, it does seem to be that people were genuinely feeling better from being there. He draws crowds after crowd after crowd. And certainly the narrative suggests that he has got some sort of power. So right. I think it does provide evidence. Whether it's compelling or not is obviously a matter of faith and belief, which is the whole point of the episode.
Right.
I
Agent
think not.
Michaels? Agent Dan?
I think it doesn't.
It doesn't?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think there's necessarily evidence. I think, as they had mentioned in the episode, people believe what they want to believe. And if you have the faith that this can happen, maybe you're wishing it into fruition, but I don't think that there's any evidence that's necessarily there. But I do tend to be a science-based person, not super religious, so I think that's going to make me a little bit biased.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of evidence that suggests, because of the placebo effect, some placebo effects have been documented as having some, people have found, better health, even though they're taking placebos. They just believe that they're taking the medication that they think they are. And that's an interesting truth that's been documented in medical science. Faith itself, if there's strong enough faith, and there's a connection there as well, belief in something, belief in finally, and even today, people, are coached, life coaches, envision the future you want to have for yourself, believe that you can get there. So this power of belief, whether it's coming through belief in a medical kind of intervention, or maybe in a faith-based approach, it does have some kind of impact. I'm not sure whether or not the episode has compelling evidence for that. It definitely paints the picture. It definitely shares that there's this issue that could be something that people can find or value from. What I found was interesting in the episode was Mulder's talk about the changing of the electromagnetic, basically the body is just one electromagnetic kind of battery, or however he phrased it, and that some people could have some ability to alter that and manipulate that, which I think is a merging of that scientific kind of reality of exploration and understanding the physical kind of existence that we all have, and this idea of faith, which has been shown to change some of the electromagnetic components of the way your body works. So it could be just the merging of those two things.
I think Einstein sort of really pulls apart this idea in terms of when he talks about the human body, or any body actually. He talks about there being a matter and then an electrical field, and that each of those two things can be affected in different ways. And there's obviously the electromagnetic kind of spectrum radiation, gravitational waves, all that kind of thing that we're beginning to understand in more detail. And then you've got the matter and that electromagnetic field. I mean, we're very grounded, I think, in the limitations of Western medicine and this idea of the physical. You treat the physical and everything else kind of is a bit fluffy and a bit kind of spiritual. But I mean, Eastern philosophies and medicines will look at prana, will look at chi, will look at this life force, not so much as a spirit, but as an energetic source of healing and harm. So, and there's certainly evidence that people that work with those kind of electromagnetic fields can have a massive impact on the well-being of a person, and not just people, but it's been tested on lab rats, mice, plants. So you can enhance plant growth and speed and successful plant growth basically through a healer, if you want to use that phrase, using their way of channeling the electromagnetic force around that being. And I'm not sure if plants have belief systems in the same way as us. I haven't had a chat with one recently, but it would seem to dispel the idea of a placebo theory, if a plant just grows more. So,
but one could argue that the having a belief system, right, having a faith was one of the methods of harnessing that understanding and that appreciation, right, of some type of force or some type of influence that can have positive effect on the human body, on the human experience, whether it's physical or mental. So this notion that that there are people that can influence that's beyond medical, beyond medicinal, I think is an important one, and that is acknowledged at least in part in this episode. So here's a question. So
sorry, to just add one thing, because I guess the opening question we've got here is any compelling evidence. We do see the resurrection of Leonard Vance. I mean, he has been declared dead by the doctors at the beginning, right? You literally say this little boy lay hands on, and that is all he does. And then he is a walking, talking, very active participant in the rest. And he's angry he's been resurrected. So is that compelling? I don't know. I mean, what else would you use to assign meaning or kind of explanation to why that man came back from the dead? And that's an interesting one.
Right.
Well, I think it's a story. I don't think it necessarily provides evidence. Because it's narrative, it's media narrative format. What laying on of hands reminded me of was an experience I personally had with Reiki, where being told that by the practitioner, first of all, that this would work, and then realizing, well, if I believe that it doesn't actually have an effect.
Right.
That's what I experienced.
So let's assume for a second that these kinds of miraculous gifts were possible, right? And we can't reject it out of hand, but we can, for the moment, accept it as a possibility. So if gifts like those presented in the episode, if those gifts were possessed, and let's say specifically by children, because that's how it was framed in the episode, should they be using them? Should they be encouraged to use them? What do you think?
I think it's a slippery slope. You have something that, if it is in fact real, does a child understand the power? Does the child have the maturity to utilize that power in a safe and appropriate manner? Kids can be really impulsive, so that could be something that could potentially be taken and used in a way that's not positive. It looks like, and this is conjecture on my part, that Samuel's father kind of shaped him to utilize this gift for positive. But if you had somebody that had that ability but didn't have somebody to shape what you should be doing with it, that could go really wrong really fast.
Right. Dan?
I guess that's... Oh, sorry. Go on then, Agent Dan.
No, sorry. What were you going to say?
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I guess we've got students and children, who have exceptional talents and exceptional gifts in all sorts of other ways. And we almost always encourage them to pursue them. If you've got somebody with a brilliant scientific mind, you help them to use that for good. It doesn't mean they're going to in the end, but you would encourage them down a positive path of scientific progress, as opposed to becoming a Dr. Frankenstein or something like that, So I think it's anything, isn't it? The tool, if it's there, it's about education around, well, what are the outcomes for that? I think my questions, my issue with it probably more is about, I don't think it happens in this case, but people profiting or benefiting from using children's talent. So I can think of like child stars and child prodigies who actually have been really, platformed by the adults in their life and subjected to actually, forms of, I would argue, emotional abuse and worse. In this case, he seems to be quite a loving father. They're making a lot of money out of it, which I think is an interesting, issue within the episode. But he does seem to be genuinely, my son is amazing. Look at what my son can do. And the son seems to have done it by choice. But that idea about consent and not having that sound judgment, has Samuel always wanted to, or has he kind of been put on that path,
Yeah, that was going to be my kind of interjection. Is I don't think the episode did a good job really definitively showing whether that was something he actually wanted to do, or was it just, hey, obviously when he was older you could see that there was a little bit of argument there of, I don't really think I want to do this. But as a child, did he get a choice? Did he actually want to do this, or was he being exploited?
I think there's a question there, but I think the episode is I would say clear enough, because he does actually do it, and he's not to the point of coercion where the father is like saying like, do this, or in that scene, in that initial scene.
Well, it does strike me in two different ways as being important to to ask those questions. First, I think it's a matter of perspective, right? What's good for one is not necessarily good for another, and it all depends on what side of the lane you're standing on or standing in that will determine that. The second is, I think there's a lot of there's an illusion here, or some imagery here of the Father and the Son. And of the Holy Spirit, right? So there's this notion, there's this imagery of the Father encouraging the Son to do good, but the Son falls out of it. There's some parallels between the story of Christ and the story of Samuel in this episode, and we can get further into that as we discuss. But there are some things to consider there, as well as this notion of perspective, because we would see Samuel's gifts as doing something positive, but it hasn't always worked out that way for everyone he's encountered. And I'm not just talking about the people that were poisoned, right? I'm talking about, some other people. Does the good outweigh the bad when children are involved? So this is kind of relating to what Andrew was saying. Andrew, you mentioned that, the kids, they're shaped and molded, but if they're doing good, does that outweigh the risk? What do you think?
I think psychologically, if you're forcing a kid to do something, whether it has a positive outcome or not, isn't necessarily good for the individual. And again, it's that slippery slope of, you're taking a look at good for numerous people versus what's good for, the holder of the gift, so to speak.
If society benefits from something, yet one child is harmed, is
Right.
that a net positive or a net negative?
And
Right?
I can't answer that. I tend to be very middle ground with those things because I look at both sides of it, and I don't have a definitive response. So
Okay.
that's not very
Yeah.
helpful, but
No, that's
Quite a
that's
quantity.
fine.
I think the child in question can, like, I was thinking about how, like, in my youth, I really liked the music of Michael Jackson, and he would talk about like having been abused as a kid, but like thankful to the father in a way because the father's passion like moved him to explore music and develop his musical skill. So yeah, obviously like examples like that, like the kid can grow up and become thankful to the parent, even if it was seen as abusive at the time, you know, or the kid can be thankful for the effects that that's had. So
Yeah, like in Asia, there's the concept of the tiger mom, right? The mom who's constantly pushing, never satisfied with any performance, never any achievement the child has. It's always like acknowledged, but now push yourself to the next level. And there's always this churning, this constant pressure, right? And some people would argue that that's an abusive scenario, but it's cultural. So each culture gets to define, and sometimes that cultural attitude about something shifts over time. What was acceptable 50 years ago and considered just normal practice of parenting and good parenting at that, pushing your children and not accepting just anything, that's shifted, that's changed now, and it's a different kind of guiding principles for parenting exists. So I think it generational and cultural, those attitudes are different. Annie, want to jump in?
I think there's a couple of issues in terms of how Samuel's gift is used. I mean, initially what we have is he's taken over as a very young boy, clearly, to this man who's effectively dead, and lays hands on him. And that's not, I mean, maybe the man in that moment would have wanted to be saved, but certainly the narrative plays out that he didn't actually want to live in that condition. So it's a non-consensual use of power, actually. Whereas in the ministry, everybody is coming there willingly. Everybody is not only coming there willingly, but saying, please heal me, please lay your hands on me. And Samuel presumably doesn't have, I mean, he seems to choose a little bit, doesn't he, in terms of who he spends a bit more time with in that front row, particularly. So there's something there about why is he choosing particular people, and what does that mean? But at least it's consensual. So I think by the time he's got to that age, unless he has been completely mind warped and really abused into that position, he does appear to be there willingly. And the thing that's actually messing with his mind is the fact that he now believes, because of the poisonings, that his powers are killing people. That's the thing that's really driving him to drink, driving him, that's the more harmful bit, obviously. It's the deception of that effectively still quite young man.
just like he says, like Jesus, he believes that Jesus has judged him.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, and it makes the actions of Judas in this particular story even more heinous, because it wasn't just killing the body; it was trying to destroy the spirit.
Right? Yeah, precisely. And that's for me the bit where he's really abused.
Right. So let's focus on Samuel for a second. Samuel's minister father describes him as feeling things that no one else can, indicating he's somehow hypersensitive or more connected to the people around him and the people he works with. His ability comes from that ability to feel. That's how it was described. How is this Samuel's strength, and how else is it his weakness?
I think, in this gift, it's a strength because it's going to give you opportunity. It's bringing something positive to the world on one side of the coin. The flip side of that, the weakness, putting Samuel in the position to be exploited. I'm sure that going to school, that probably made him somewhat of a pariah. Why is this kid so weird? Why can he do this? What's he going to do to me? I think that probably opens up some vulnerability for him, again, as a child. And for me, it keeps going back to that trade-off. And I think in turn, the psyche of a young child, I think that's going to have a pretty profound effect on an individual, and in turn affect you as an adult and create some weaknesses, not necessarily of character, but perhaps self-esteem, as he went through and these things started happening, these deaths started occurring. I can't imagine having that happen. It's like you have this gift and you're supposed to heal, and these people are dying. What's happening? I think for me, I would have shut down. That would have been how I would have reacted to it. But in this case, he has this ability to feel, and that might actually end up being a weakness because he can't walk away from it. He can't just say, all right, I'm done. How do you, when there's so much suffering in the world around us, there's so many people, there's so much hurt, how do you say, I'm done because it looks like something bad has happened here, when you have so many people essentially begging for you to heal them, help them?
I think it's like a lot of people say, like, talk about being empaths, and they say like it can be helpful for other people, but at the same time it can be like a heavy, a heaviness or a heavy burden for them personally as well.
Because they take on a lot, right?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is you don't see, and I think that's one of the limitations of this episode, you don't see a particularly intimate, loving relationship with the father, though he clearly adores him. You don't see those scenes where they support each other, and you don't see Samuel with any friends or any other connections. He's in this big old house with this big old Cadillac, but he's like a lonely child star, isn't he? It's like you're surrounded by people who want you, but they want effectively to use your power, and they love you, but they love you because of what you can give them. And if you are like an empath, like Dan's suggesting, and this is an extension of the idea of the healer, isn't it? Is that you can tap in and actually, maybe it's energy fields, but maybe it's just reading people really well and knowing what they need to hear and telling them it. All of those things mean that you would take on a huge personal burden. And then when it becomes, this belief that that his power has become warped and he's killing people. I mean, the emotional toll of that, you literally see him trying to die, don't you? I mean, he's in the bar, he's starting fights, he's drinking, he's doing everything he can to not live anymore effectively. So
yeah, I mean, this notion of exploitation, right? This notion of leveraging that natural gift and have, for necessarily good, but also for personal gain. That's hanging over the ministry. It's hanging over the minister, right? In this episode, you do end up questioning whether the minister is there for the benefit to the community or benefiting himself through benefiting the community. So that leads to this question: was the minister using Samuel, or was there a genuine care for the boy and for the community? So, I mean, which comes first from the reading that we have in the episode? How would you qualify the minister's motivation?
I think the minister would argue that he's doing it because he's been given a gift by God. I mean, he says at one point, my gift is preaching, your gift is healing. They're gifts from God. And, if you take that, and he doesn't come across as somebody who's any deeper than that, actually. And this is the trouble, because, when we tap into that idea of faith, we want to have faith in someone that they would use that gift for good. And the financial benefit comes basically as like a thank you kind of thing. But I mean, they are making a lot of money, and I don't know, I'm not Christian myself, but my understanding of the core tenet of Christianity is that it's about helping those less fortunate than you. And yes, the healing's doing that, but if you could then invest that money in the community or charity work, wouldn't you? I don't know. It's an interesting one.
What do you think, Dan? Andrea, what do you think? So challenging, this question.
I think if for me, having grown up Catholic, it's really hard as an adult to kind of take a look at religion and look at it in a very different light than I saw it when I was a kid. And I genuinely believe that people that go on to ministry and become preachers want to help. I would say by and large, those individuals do want to help and they do care. I cannot fathom finding a child, raising that child up, and not having some sort of bond or connection with them. I do think there was genuine care there.
Right.
But I feel in this particular case, you had somebody that saw the gift and took the opportunity to then exploit. Whether that was intentional or it started as something small and kind of snowballed.
Mhm.
I don't know. But I do think he did care for Samuel. It just kind of seems like there was a disconnect somewhere. And, maybe that was that streak that Samuel had of, trying to walk away at a point as he got older that put that wedge that seemed to be between the two of them. Or,
Yeah.
as Samuel kind of got to the point of he was an adult, he can think for himself. Um,
And the burden
I
started to pile up on him,
Yeah,
right?
how do you tell the person that has done so much for you that didn't have to do anything for you, "I don't
Right.
wanna do this anymore,"
And
And
that's
it's
it mirrors actually the journey of Christ in his life,
Mhm. Yeah,
right? It's
absolutely.
very similar so it was the structure of the story kind of had that parallel. But the thing that Dan, are you there?
Yep.
So what are your thoughts before I share mine?
So I thought I agreed with Andrea, and I thought that the exploitative way that the
Okay.
father treats the son, I thought was deliberate. And like watching the scenes, like it, when they're in the tent, the ministry tent and stuff like that, and the father is like clearly like so showy and stuff like that. And I was remembering, well, there are certain scriptures in the Bible, the Christian Bible, that say like don't do things in a showy manner, and yet like
Hmm.
the minister is
I'm gonna
Right.
kinda piggyback onto what Dan just said there. There is a song lyric from, my goodness, probably the early 2000s, and it's from a song called Affirmation, and the lyric is, "I believe that God does not endorse TV evangelists." And just kind of the irony there. And,
Mm,
like, Agent Dan said, you have this really showy, over the top, and when you look at what the Bible says and what church says, it's like, that's not what you're supposed to be. And, that lyric has always resonated with me, again, having the background with the Catholic Church, and then just what he's saying, it all clicks.
Yeah, so I actually, as I was watching the episode, I was reminded that there's always been these tent evangelicals that go through circuits, and they move from town to town. But then, with the advent of television, they were able to set up shop in certain locations, and they have these prosperity ministries now that are very much evangelical, and there's huge. There's not an tent any longer, but they have huge auditoriums, and these churches have thousands and thousands of people attend. So it struck me as very similar to that. But what also struck me in the episode was that the argument that was being made wasn't for the belief in faith healing, but rather the the questioning about whether or not faith healing was real, and the suspicion throughout the entire episode that it was fake. And we were given hints, especially through how Mulder was reacting, right? That maybe there was something to it. The the people that surrounded Samuel were all, yes, 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 this is real, and we love it, and obviously there were people being taken advantage of. But the sheriff was the one who was very skeptical, right? But it turned out by the
mm,
end of the story that we were being pushed into the camp of maybe it is. Maybe Samuel was the real deal, right? So what the concern that I'm having that the episode is painting is kind of like the idea of don't let your skepticism cloud your observation and
mm,
your thinking. Don't prejudge, kind of thing, right? That's where I think that the episode was taking us, because if we come in thinking, oh well, all ministers are in this vein are going to be taking advantage of their people and kind of you know exploiting the kid, and that changes our perspective of the character, right? And obviously there was some affection there. There was some sincere care for Samuel from the
I
guy.
can't imagine having raised him into his early 20s and not
Yeah.
having a bond or caring, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
So
And
the
if
way
it was
they presented,
if it was
Go-
solely to make money off of his abilities, you
right,
know, when he put his foot down or started to really hesitate about doing any of those things, I think the reaction would have been much more, yeah, get out. I don't need you. You know, you're dead to me, because it's like, what are you doing for me? So there had to have been some sort of bond there.
and then that moment when Samuel can't be at the event, that's the very beginning of the episode, right? Samuel can't be at the event, but he jumps out there and starts ministering, and he says to them, you know, Samuel will be back in 2 days for this special event. And he hypes it up, right? He's a hype guy. He's got the microphone. He's hyping it up. The people in the crowd who are disappointed that Samuel can't be there, they suddenly react in a very joyful, almost rapturous kind of sense. Was that well, first, why did they react that way, and was it reasonable?
I think
What do
it's
you
that
think?
idea of it's manipulation of the crowd, isn't it? It's like, you know,
Right.
I'm so sorry, but I've got terrible news. But don't worry, because, you know, so in that tiny gap, it was like, we're never going to see him, and we've traveled from all over the country or whatever they were all claiming to have
Whiplash.
done. You know, yeah. And literally, it's like, I'm so sorry, this, but don't worry. And actually, if you've traveled the whole way or you live locally, 2 days isn't a long time. If it was going to be in
Right.
2 months' time, you know, he'll be back. So I think it just shows the power of faith and the power of belief, and that idea of wanting it so badly. And they're all there, remember, because they're ill, like, or they're with someone that's ill. So you're desperate, absolutely
Right.
desperate. And presumably a lot of those people are there because, you know, medicine hasn't worked for them, or it's an ongoing problem. And so that place of desperation, you'll take whatever, right? Of course, you're going to wait 2 days. You're going to do anything you possibly can because you're already in that place of trauma.
Right.
With
Right.
crowd scenes like that, I always think, like, I always wonder how difficult that would be to direct with so many people in the shot and having to all, you know, emphasize a particular emotion or reaction. Surely it might be quite difficult. I've always thought.
I reckon they did a
Well-
genuine bit of hyping them up before, and it's like, look, this is the level we need to get to, you know, where you're getting like a crowd going, like an assembly or something, you take them right up there, and then it's like, and now, you know, and you can do that with groups of people. It's not too hard. So I would do that with a scene like that.
Having directed crowds like that for different productions that I've been, you assign certain emotional states. So when you hear this, I want you to react in this way. So you have a variety across, and you can say, give me more of this or give me less of that, or, you know, make it more inner focus. And, you know, so you change it up. So you have different levels playing in the background. Okay. So we've been having a good conversation about the structure of the faith healing and the characters involved in that particular part of the story. I'm going to shift now to Mulder and Scully. So there's mention of Scully's faith within this episode, and there's also of obviously Mulder's faith, but in particular his faith in his sister and being able to see his sister again, which drives him, as you know, it's his motivation for what's going on in the episodes. Do you think this adds, or does it take away from the overall story that they're telling in this episode?
I think it's interesting that it goes down the path of Mulder's faith, given Scully's, you know, quite obvious cross that she wears around her neck. But I mean, there's a couple of really great lines in this. I think the script writing has highs and lows, but a couple of the really good bits for me were Scully quite early on says, imagine a miracle and you're halfway there. And I was like, oh, this is about faith. And she says, that's what they teach you in medical school. I'm like, oh, and it is that thing of you can hold both and you can have both. So I think for her faith isn't being tested with this, because she looks at this crowd and thinks, well, they're ill. They'll have tried, you know, this, they're here to do that. It makes sense to her, I think, you know, potentially from the two roles that she plays, you know, as a doctor, medical doctor, and someone of faith. Whereas Mulder, you know, does not have faith in the conventional sense. He has this unconventional belief in the truth. And, you know, very early on, he gets the line of people want to believe, you know, which is beautifully, you know, cute and dry and everything coming from him. And he does want to believe that his sister's alive. So the minute that the boy kind of says, well, you've lost someone, and he starts off by saying your brother, and Mulder's about to go, I don't have a brother, and he says poor sister, and Mulder's hooked, like straight. That's all it took was the mention of the word sister, and he's captivated. And that is the power of faith and the power of belief right there. So I mean, do I think the visions are particularly effective? No, not really. But do I understand why they did it? Yeah, completely.
It almost seems like Mulder is almost eager to embrace the possibility, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he falls. If you think of it, he's fallen for the same kind of line that most mystics, right, that we have seen portrayed in media have tracked. Everyone's going to have some, unless they're a single, an only child. Everyone's going to have some conflict with a sibling. Everyone's going to have pain and trauma from their childhood, right? It's leveraged.
But not only that, but a lot of like religious people would think of like other humans as brothers and sisters. You know, but it occurred to me a word that was used earlier to describe the feeling in the crowd, which was desperation.
And I think definitely that's a word to describe what Mulder internally deals with concerning his sister.
Yeah.
Because even though Scully is the one with the religious faith, she's very clinical in how she views the situation. She sees it from a medical doctor. She sees a symptom and she defines the cause, right? While Mulder, who's basically having faith in this, you know, like space and aliens and all that, but he is willing to embrace the spiritual aspect of Samuel's power and his ability. He may see it not as having a divine, you know, origin, but I would argue that we can't really define that, because who knows what has put into what we call scientific truth may just be, you know, the machinations of some kind of divine kind of, anyway, power. But okay, so
I think just to add one little bit on that, I think Mulder is driven by completely selfish motivations in this episode.
Yeah.
I think he gets completely, and he does what everyone else does, which is comes to Samuel and follows Samuel and wants something from him. And ultimately, you know, go on.
He has the tagline, I want to believe, and he does.
Yeah.
So it holds true to the character. And to the question was, is this adding or taking away from the episode? I think it adds to the episode. I think it deepens and enriches. It holds true to the characters as well. It's not something that just kind of is random and kind of out of place. This is part of the journey, and we can see it as connected to what they're experiencing.
I guess in a way it's also harking back to the end of Conduit, where there's the parallel between faith in Jesus, or you know, religious faith, and Mulder's faith in the second coming of his sister.
So who would you say is more open-minded in this, Dan? Would you say that it's Mulder that's more open-minded, or Scully that's more open-minded to the premise of the episode?
I'd say it was Mulder.
Okay.
But Scully's the one that solves the case. So I think Mulder is going on his own personal journey, but Scully's the one who recognizes that the answer, the truth in this case, is going to be in the scientific evidence. Without the autopsy, they can't solve the case because they won't find the killer. And, you know, and Samuel ultimately, I think, would have continued on a downward spiral. More and more people would have died. So she doesn't lose her head. She's like, and that conversation she has to have with the father of the last girl that dies, last woman that dies, she uses her faith. She says, I understand where you are, but can you really let this go? And it's her sensitivity and her sophistication of balancing that the role of the investigator with her recognition of what it means to be a woman of faith, a man of faith.
I'm sorry, I don't think I agree with you, because you described like the truth of the case and stuff like that as an objective, like ultimate is discovered. I think the absolute points out that truth can be subjective, and like Mulder sees his sister in the mirror, but it's like I think that's showing that the truth can be subjective.
I think I mean the truth as in find the killer, which is kind of what they're there to do. I mean, finding his sister is a much longer narrative. Does it give him faith to keep pursuing that dream? Absolutely. Would he have done it anyway? Absolutely. So it's possibly just bolsters his belief that it's worth seeking her. But actually, without Scully's investigation of the murders and, finding out who did it, and Leonard obviously then poisons himself, but I mean, ultimately all the crimes as in that are happening within the world are solved. And that is down to Scully. Mulder's really just kind of floating on in his own little world, I think.
Yeah.
I actually looked at that moment between Scully and the father as being a little exploitive. And she had a job to do, and she wasn't going to get it done without his help. So she exploited his pain and her faith and got it done. And that's not a judgment on her character. I think it actually enriches kind of, we see her as a very sympathetic character all the time, but she's there, as you said, to do a job, and she needs to clinically approach it using a tool that she has at her disposal. And that was what I saw she did.
I don't know if it's necessarily exploiting in that particular situation, but I think obviously she was approaching it from a scientific standpoint, but at the same time, I do think she had a valid argument in telling him, hey, if we don't do this, we may not be able to find out what actually happened. That is a very, very true statement. And okay, did it perhaps prey on the situation? Yes. I don't necessarily feel that it was to exploit the situation that they were in. I think that there was relevance to what she was saying, and her having a religious background, I think she would also know why they would have some apprehension about allowing the medical procedure to actually occur. So I think there was some empathy there. I don't think it was necessarily done just, hey, I got a job to do, and whatever I need to do is what's going to happen.
I recollect. I mean, and the reason I use the word exploit is because in my memory of the scene, she uses the term, and maybe I'm misremembering, but she uses the term, "How would you feel if?" Am I misremembering? Because
I don't remember verbatim, so I don't know.
Okay. So my recollection, that phrasing of it is a tug on the emotional heartstring. Yeah. And in an emotional situation, she's plucking that cord, and that is intentional. So for me, that's why. But it's quibbling over semantics, really, about she got to the end of what she wanted out of it.
I think you've got the broader context, though, in terms of the vigil that's being held outside the hospital by Leonard Vance, who is absolutely manipulating that to ensure that he can continue to murder people. Yeah. So where we talk about, well, who's manipulating who and in what scenario, it's like, well, what's the motivation behind it? And I'm not saying that the end justifies the means always, but I think in this case, absolutely it does. And you have to counter what's being done to those parents by the wider community.
And it's obviously, again, a matter of perspective. It matters, which side of the line you're standing on. And Andrea and I are standing on opposite sides of that line there.
No, I'm not saying that. I don't think you're wrong. I just think that exploit is
maybe too harsh. Okay,
too harsh of a term. I think that it was maybe manipulation isn't much better. I understand what she was doing there and why she said what she said.
Right.
But I do very much feel that there's validity in what she said. It's not like it just came out of left field and it's like, I got to say whatever I got to say.
Do you think we've already addressed this notion of belief and faith from Mulder. He wants to believe, and this episode allows him to kind of grasp onto that. But I was wondering about the sequence of the episodes. EBE, right? Last episode, and this episode, Miracle Man. It seems so. EBE seems to be about a sense of Mulder's journey. He's defeated. He doesn't get what he wants, but then he almost recommits himself, right? It's about faith lost, faith found, or recommitted. EBE is about, there's obvious connections to faith, and it's important to both the journey of Mulder and Scully, right? So do you think that the sequencing is intentional in terms of Mulder's journey? And I'm thinking from a programmatic kind of perspective as producers making decisions. It was because they came up with all these stories, right? Did they say, "Oh, this would be a perfect pairing to EBE"? What do you think?
I think there's not much to segue between those two. I wouldn't think that it was done intentionally. That's just my opinion.
Regarding programming, I've been thinking while we've been doing this podcast over the weeks that we've been doing it, that probably there was some consideration to, well, is this a Scully episode or is this a Mulder episode? And, who's this going to develop more and stuff like that?
I think he certainly has a loss of faith in EBE, and he's been hanging on to Deep Throat's narrative, almost in a way being preached to. And there's that great line that, I don't know which lie to believe anymore. And in this episode, that gets mirrored again, because you've got the down to earth sheriff at the beginning who's like, 99% of people in the world are fools, and the rest of us are in danger of being infected, or whatever, contagion. And so he's there going, well, obviously it's rubbish, isn't it? And yet he turns out to organize and orchestrate the killing of a boy. And so it's like, so he's abusing his position. So therefore we can't trust people like Deep Throat. We can't trust sheriffs and police authority. And at that point, where do you put your faith? Do we put our faith in each other? Do we seek, meaning in miracles or meaning in healers? Or, I think, and Mulder is grasping for something to believe in. And that's why the use of his sister is so powerful, because ultimately, if he can believe she's still out there, that's the truth he's seeking. So I think EB is about another kind of kickback to Mulder in terms of, you thought you had another person beyond Scully that you could believe in, and you don't. So where are you going to go next? What are you going to do? Which makes him very vulnerable, and Scully recognizes that, which is why she absolutely carries him through this episode. And again, it shows you how professional and how clear-headed Scully can be in amidst Mulder's personal crises, of which there are many.
I was considering how this episode connects to a different episode, which is Young at Heart, because I looked up what episodes Michael Lang directed, and the only previous one was Young at Heart. And I thought, both episodes deal with healing, or medical stuff in some context or another. I couldn't really see any other connections between them apart from that.
Okay. In that case, there'd be the connection to Scully. And then there'd be the kind of progression of her story and how she's moving through kind of all these different events, and her character is becoming more rich, more full, right? For sure. That's why I think both of them have moments that tell us something about their character development, right? Their arc. So she's the one of, as I mentioned before, she's the one of faith, but she sees this issue of faith not through her lens of faith, but rather through her medical experience, right? She identifies what these people are experiencing and defines what's causing it. While Mulder is the opposite. He completely gets into the faith part of it. He starts believing. Because he is at his heart, he's desperate for the truth. He wants to find out what happened to his sister and why, right? So he's grasping. So I guess maybe he, in essence, he's while he seems very calm and put together most of the time, maybe within he's just as desperate and on edge as the people who are seeking faith healing. It's interesting.
I think, like, some people have said that they consider Scully the main character of the X-Files, but I think I've always considered Mulder the main character, and I think it's because of that aspect of that he's actually, which is typical of the stereotypical hero's journey, where they're on the quest for something that they don't have. I don't really see that sort of parallel in Scully so much, unless I'm missing something.
Okay, well, it's fair enough. I think that one of the benefits of, or one of the great things about the episode was that it was a tandem. It was a duo, right? Each character had just as much at risk in each season story arc, and they played off each other so well. That's what made the show so successful. I know that we're getting short on our time, so I'm going to jump ahead. We've talked about the parallels between Christ and God and the religious kind of connections. Is it a bit heavy-handed that the character Leonard, who's the Judas of the episode, is it heavy-handed that he was scarred by fire? Is it a little bit? Is it a metaphor for that evil? Kind of those burn marks on his flesh? What do you guys think?
I mean, I think it at times becomes extremely heavy-handed. I mean, Samuel is this miracle baby that he's found in the reeds.
Right.
He rescues this guy who's literally been captured by an inferno and brings him back from the dead, who then turns out to turn against him and be some sort of devil. The beating scene in the cell, I mean, he's literally been crucified up against the railings, isn't he? Then of course he comes back from the dead, then there's visions, then there's repentance, then there's forgiveness. I mean, it's greatest hits, isn't it? And it's kind of, we can tick all those boxes. So I did feel it was a bit heavy-handed, but then I also think it's supposed to be dramatic, because the story of Christ is extremely dramatic. That's why it's memorable and interesting. So Samuel has to suffer, and Samuel has to be tested, and he has to have the devil personified trying to take him down. Right. So
Dan, Andrea, what do you guys think? Was it heavy-handed or just right?
I think I understand the metaphor part of it for evil with the fire and all of that. I think when they were probably trying to figure out, as they wrote the episode, how are we going to disfigure this individual, having terrible burns over the entirety of your body to the point where you are very disfigured, is going to really drive home the point of, this is a man who, why would I want to live like this? And has that animosity towards Samuel for bringing him back from the brink or death, whichever that was. I mean, I feel like if maybe they did something else that was just kind of over the top, that might have been heavy-handed. But in this particular case, you had something that we've seen happen to people before. And I consider myself to be a pretty empathetic person, an empath. I understand why he would feel how he would feel. I don't think I would understand why he would choose to do what he did to other people, but I can understand where he was coming from. And I think it made sense that they wrote that as his disfiguration versus whatever else they may have come up with. And in turn, as a metaphor for evil as well.
I think it's probably an attempt to make him like sympathetic and be, seen as more victim. So the audience and the viewers aren't like immediately like, oh, he's going to turn out to be the killer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess it would have been heavy-handed if they'd given him a big black hat and dressed him in black all the time and dressed the other characters in white with white,
A pitchfork.
Wait a second. They did do that.
a mustache.
He's
to
got
blow.
shades on as well. I mean, he literally has like
Yeah.
these dark eyes. You never see his eyes, and he's just there going, "We will do this now," sort of turning and walking away.
Yeah.
And he is spectral. I mean, he does feel like somebody that shouldn't, be alive. Like somehow it is a supernatural sort of ghost-like, ghoul-like presence, and and that's
And for John's benefit, I'll have to add also this whole idea of the wig in the night scene. John,
I didn't even think of that until I
gotcha.
saw that in the chat.
That was a little bit odd too. He's sleeping, in a hairpiece. Yeah.
When I saw that bit rewatching the episode today, I was just like, why? Why is there some sort of dead creature on his head? I don't understand.
It just occurred to me that both this episode and Young at Heart have the killers that have like a physical deformity or what have you.
Why does Leonard wait so long to get his revenge?
So
because the child grows to be an adult. So, what is that? 20 years, 18, 20 years?
I don't know if it's resentment just builds and builds, or he sees them profiting effectively from this process, or what it is. But it did feel strange to me that, it's a relatively recent flurry of killings,
Right.
You just think there's surely lots of ways you could ruin that young man's life. And why is it suddenly accelerated,
Dan,
I missed the question. I'm sorry. What was the question?
Why does Leonard wait so long for his revenge?
If I'm going off of like age, how can you frame a child?
Okay.
That's all.
So wait till he's an adult and then you can get him sent to jail.
I mean, maybe he obviously he resented the kid for bringing him back.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe though he still felt some sort of guilt of setting up a child to take the fall. I don't know. It doesn't entirely make sense to me, but
it's your idea is as valid as anyone's.
Well, I mean, in that he's setting up Samuel to take the fall for these deaths. If you are so unhappy, I get it, you're exacting your revenge on this individual who put you basically in this life when you could have died. I'm not going to say, that suicide is something that we should consider, because it certainly isn't. But I mean, if he is that absolutely miserable, I mean, he has options that don't have to involve other people.
Right.
And he's also benefiting hugely from it. I mean, he's living in that mansion with them. He's clearly benefiting financially. I mean,
sleeping
maybe
in
he's
silks.
a bit sick. Yeah, totally. I mean, living the dream, really. I mean, maybe he's sick of being kind of like the freak who was brought back from the dead, and then here's the guy that did it, and Samuel's like golden boy. But I wonder if there's also a crisis of faith, like what kind of God would bring me back like this? In the same way that people say, well, if there is a real God, why do we have such horrendous war and AIDS and all
Suffering,
these so maybe it's a loss of faith. And when he sees those visions of Samuel, and then he's talking in his sort of death throes, he's saying, I thought he was a fraud, but he's forgiven me. And that release there is actually a really beautiful scene. I mean, I think it's slightly overacted, but I think it's a beautiful scene, because he says, actually, this is what it's about, is that even when you sort of directly, I mean, he's responsible for the death of Samuel directly. And he says, even when you kill Christ or whatever Samuel is allegedly, he forgives you. That's profound. Yeah. So I thought that was an amazing moment.
Dan, do you want to jump in?
I was thinking about like forgiveness and how basically like Leonard is contradicting, for lack of a better word, some of the scriptures where Jesus said like not to take an eye for an eye, and just to turn the other cheeks and forgive people. Like
in essence, that was the problem for Leonard, right? Yeah. He wasn't able to forgive. He was living in his own personal hell, and he blamed someone else for it, right? Yeah. And he couldn't forgive. He couldn't forgive himself. He couldn't forgive for Samuel for bringing him back. I also wonder if given the story of Christ and having to suffer and, you know, all the stuff that Christ experiences. And this is a general question about faith, but specifically in this episode as well, is Leonard an instrument of God? As Judas is an instrument of God. Judas needed to do what he did for Christ to die and become the symbol that he became. Judas, or Leonard, needed to do what he did for Samuel to die and be resurrected and forgive him. And, you know, it's only our skeptical worldview of today that keeps us from recognizing the miracle of what Samuel represents in this episode. Was Leonard an instrument of God?
It's a really big, obviously it's a huge question to say, you know, thank you for that one. I like these big questions though. So I think, is he an instrument of God? I mean, if you look at Old Testament God, it's quite fierce. You know, I mean, wipe out all of humanity except for Noah and some mates on a boat. I mean, that's quite an extreme response to the sins of the world. So would that form of God be capable of doing this? Of course, absolutely. And maybe it's about bringing, you know, some of those villainous characters to justice. I mean, the police chief guy is going to go to prison for what he's done in terms of instigating Samuel's death. Obviously, Leonard takes his own life, but would have been prosecuted on the evidence as well. So it's about the removal of evil and the exposure. And I think the bit for me is when the wife of Sheriff Daniels says he was a fraud, wasn't he? He was a fraud. And when she starts to think, oh my goodness, maybe he's real, that's such a big shift. So it's about maybe showing the skeptics that they need to think a little bit harder about it, and that actually the evil that you find in society isn't where you expect it. Sometimes it's in law enforcement, and sometimes it's in people on the periphery of preaching. I don't think the preacher himself is evil. I don't think Samuel's evil, but Leonard, you know, certainly is becoming toxified or intoxicated. So yeah, it's a really, really interesting one of, does it expose the true horror and who we should mistrust in the world? Yeah, it does. Right. Is that a teaching of God? Maybe.
I'll go to another question. Final question before we wrap up. Does good or evil triumph in this episode?
I feel like good. I feel like the truth always comes out. The truth may not be what you want. It is out there.
Or what Molly wants.
And it may not be, you know, the sunshiny goodness that some people are thinking, but things work their way, the way they need to be. That's not really eloquently stated. It makes more sense in my head, but I just feel like the truth does come out eventually, and what needs to be becomes.
Right. Anybody else want to?
I'm still struggling with how, like, the question about, is Leonard an instrument of God? Even viewing it through the lens of, as Annie did, through the lens of the Old Testament, like one of the commandments that Moses was given was do not kill, do not murder.
But I think the killers in this episode are brought to justice, aren't they?
In one way or another.
Yeah, I think good wins out in this episode's story.
But yeah,
good wins out.
I think there's the question of, you can't wait around for God to solve the problems of the earth. I mean, that case gets solved because of forensic medicine. So do you sit around and wait for the healers to kind of figure it out, and for people to just go, oh, do you know what? Maybe the sheriff's not a good man, or what about that shady guy with the black hat on? Maybe we should question why he's here all the time and why he's feeding potions to particular people that walk in through the door. You know, that nobody else, because they're blinded by faith in their own different ways. They believe in different things, Sheriff Daniels and obviously the community, but they are blinded by it. And so it takes that kind of sharp razor of truth that comes from scientific process to expose that. And maybe, you know, you could argue therefore that science is the true instrument of God in this. because that's the thing that brings justice.
I would argue that the sheriff, who was very skeptical, was putting his own preconceived notions about what was acceptable, what wasn't, ahead of other people's perspectives on things, and he was imposing his worldview on others by assisting in Samuel's death. Right.
Yeah.
That's what made him, even though he was trying to be a good guy and trying to do what was right, but he was putting himself really ahead of everybody else, and that was his sin of pride. He's right, everyone else is wrong. So, I think there's and how he acted on it, right? He acted to kill somebody, which is like, wow. So
I did think I thought the
even though bad things happen, I think he was good. Wins out.
I thought the theme of pride was very important to this episode.
Well, I know we usually talk about favorite characters, but and kind of explain ourselves. But does anybody the secondary characters? Does anyone have secondary characters that they liked? And we won't bother to explain. We'll just say this is who I liked. This is who did a good job in the episode. Anyone?
I mean, he's quite a major character, but I think Samuel's performance is absolutely outstanding. He's completely captivating, and he does that. It's the great line of maybe it's this trick of the devil, and he just gives a look, and it's so good. I mean, that actor's, I love that. So I'll shut up now, but yeah.
I agree with Agent Bennett. I felt like the part was really well written, and he did a good job doing what they wanted him to do.
Yeah, as do I. I wasn't too sure about how good a job the girl who played Mulder's sister did. She's hardly in it. But also, like, there was one very brief scene. I guess, like, the part of Samantha Mulder didn't really require much of her. That's what I'm saying. But yeah, there was one very brief scene where Samuel's going through the audience or the crowd. And there's he's doing like his healing works, and there's one character who's only in it a very, very short time, but he just like passes her by. And I felt so sorry for that character.
Yeah.
Well, I like the sheriff. I think the sheriff, he had a role to play. He didn't need to be any more than what he did, which was a stoic kind of guy who, just trying to functionary. So I think the actor did a nice job of that.
I like the
the deputy with the toothpick, who was staring Mulder down.
Sweet, yeah.
That guy was a little intense. Cut back on the coffee. That's all I got to say to that guy. All right, how many X's would we give this episode out of 10? X's out of 10.
So I'm going to give it 7. And the reason I'm giving it 7 is I think the way Scully's character develops in this is really brilliant. I think, as I said, Samuel's performance is wonderful. And I think those questions about faith and truth and trust and everything are done really well. There's clunky bits, I think the Christ imagery is heavy-handed. I think the final confession scene from Leonard is, again, a little bit implausible and certainly a little bit overacted. But I really liked... Certainly, like a bit painful. But he's just seen a resurrected Christ figure, so fair dues. Maybe he's feeling a little bit out there. So yeah, I think there's clunky bits, and the writing towards the end felt a bit rushed and a little bit twisted in turns. But overall, I think there's a lot to praise. So yeah, 7 from me.
I'm gonna give it the same 7. I felt like it was an entertaining episode, a really good standalone episode, Monster of the Week. Some of the things that when you put so much stake on religion for an episode, I'm not a huge fan of that. That's just a personal preference, but I felt like there were some good secondary characters, really good writing, really good acting. overall, a pretty decent episode. So 7 for me.
Dan?
I think I would give it a 10. I was thinking I'd probably give it an 11 if that was available, but it's not.
Wow.
Oh,
But, yeah, I think it's my favorite episode of the first season we've watched yet. I can't quite remember. It comes up to the season finale, but like while we've been talking as well, it's been reminding me of. I think there are quite a few parallels between this episode and the film I Want to Believe.
okay. So if you want to give it an 11, Dan, you have to borrow one from a later episode. So we'll have to hold you accountable for that. So 8 for the next one goes down to 7.
I would borrow it from Born Again because I really don't like that episode.
Oh no, you can't go to the back. You can't go past. No.
Yeah, we
It's
don't get to
already
scratch
set.
them.
You got to go for the future ones.
So
I'd give it a
Brad-
7. I'd
7?
give it a 7. Yeah, same for the same reasons. Just a little clunky, like the imagery, but a little heavy-handed. Like some of the acting, but a little over the top. So I'm not a fan, and John knows, who's not here with us right now. He knows I'm not a fan of actors going over the top in their roles. So, or wearing black fedoras. I don't know why the black hat didn't seem to work with me.
I'm gonna wear one next episode.
Yes,
Okay.
we should all wear black fedoras. Right.
I don't think we have any. We call them shit kicker hats. It's like the big old straw hat that you wear when you're working outside. No fedoras.
Well, and on that note, I will say thank you to the panelists for joining this discussion today. Thanks, guys. Thanks for being here. We hope you, our viewers, have enjoyed it. And let us know in the comments section that what you thought of the episode. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Please remember that the truth is out there. And we'll see you next time.
With
Bye.
the cats.
Yay.